Hi, I'm Billy Cordasco, and today, here at the Arizona Nordic Village, we have a very special guest, Dr. Ed Hoover. He's going to be presenting to the Babbitt Ranches community a presentation on relationship intelligence. We hope you enjoy it.
Good to see you all again. I can't believe it's been a whole year since I was here last time, Mike. You all have this book, right? And the title of the book is Stewardship and Succession Plan. Now, we all understand what succession plan is, right? It's the transitioning of a business in terms of its leadership and its management and its ownership from one generation to the next. The reason stewardship is here is because it's not just passing a business on, it's a purpose bigger than all of us. It's the responsibility of managing a trust. I don't mean a legal trust, but I'm talking about a trust. I like to think about it as in the case of a family, you know, we create our children, but we don't own our children. Our responsibility is to be stewards of our children and help them grow up to be responsible, contributing adults. And in the business sense, the business is like our child, that we have responsibility for looking after and taking care of and making sure we leave it a better place than we found it. Whether it's the land is part of the business, whether it's the leadership in the business, stewards are paying attention to that. Now, if that's important in here, who are the stewards in this plan? All of you are stewards. All of you are stewards. And I like to use from time to time biblical analogies, and I know that you're a cattle ranching operation and it's anathema for sheep, but in any case, you know, the idea of the shepherd, the steward, who sometimes has to do things that he or she didn't want to do because the animals that were entrusted to them needed to be cared for. You have that experience with your cattle. You have to do some things. Maybe you don't feel like getting up in the morning and doing what you're going to have to do that day, but you're the steward. They depend upon you. This business depends upon you as the stewards of this business. I think I shared this last time when I was here, but there's a book that was published a number of years, quite a few years ago now, called Built to Last. Anybody read the book Built to Last? It's an interesting book. It was a study was done by some Harvard researchers, and they wanted to find out what the difference was between really good companies and really excellent companies. And so they went out and they asked CEOs of companies to nominate companies that they thought were the best of the best of the best. And they categorized them in three levels. They had the silver medal winners, they had the bronze, and they had the gold. And I'll make the story real short, but there was one difference that these researchers came up with about that caused the difference between the bronze level companies and the gold level companies. And it was very simply this. In the gold level companies, come on in, those companies had a sense of purpose beyond themselves, which is what you're talking about and what Susan's talking about. None of you created this business, this organization. And it's going to last beyond you. Your job as stewards is to care for it, nurture it, and make it better for the next generation. And that's what the succession process is all about. And that's why stewardship is so critical to that. The pyramid of succession. I put this together, and Billy and I worked on this to try to help put together a visual that would depict and illustrate what succession planning is all about. And you notice what's at the bottom of the pyramid, the base of the pyramid? Healthy relationships. Okay? The second tier on the pyramid is a healthy business. Okay? And you can see underneath of that, we define a healthy relationship, and I'm going to talk some more about this, as a relationship built around trust, respect, and optimism. A healthy business is organized around being efficient, being productive, and being profitable, okay, which was mentioned earlier. Then on top of that, you have the legal and financial mechanisms for the succession planning process. Things like buy-sell agreements and trust documents and ownership restrictions and all of that legal stuff, and also the financial piece in terms of transferring it and the implications in terms of the taxes and the IRS and all that. And at the very top, at the pinnacle, is estate planning. And that's the individual aspect of this, because part of the succession planning process is that all of you as owners have the responsibility to manage your own personal finances through your own estate planning. Okay? So we start at the foundation. The base is our relationships. And I'm going to talk about why that's at the base. When you look at this, where do you think most succession planning processes, where does most of it start? Which of these 4 tiers does it usually start at? At the top. Yeah, it usually starts up somewhere up in here. And what happens is that the relationships and the business get neglected. And the truth of the matter is, if you don't have a business, you don't need a succession plan, right? But the business often gets neglected because people aren't paying attention to the issues of keeping the business healthy, and they aren't paying attention to the very base of this, which is keeping relationships healthy. Now, so it often gets turned on its head. Now, I want to talk a little bit about why relationships are at the base of the triangle. Why are those so fundamental to everything else? Well, I want to share with you, and when I talk about relationships, I'm talking about what I call significant interpersonal relationships, as opposed to transactional relationships. Transactional relationships are those like you have with the teller at the bank, if your bank still has tellers. Mine has 1 or 2 left, I think. Or the clerk in the store or whatever, where there's a transaction that takes place and that's the extent of your relationship. But in significant interpersonal relationships, there is important economic, psychological, emotional, social ramifications to that relationship. In other words, it affects you in all of those ways. And why do we have it then at the bottom of the triangle? Well, I want to share with you some research studies about the importance of relationships in our lives. And I'm going to read these, so make it quick. This is from Harvard Medical School in 2010. A study of data for more than 309,000 people found that the lack of strong relationships increased the risk of premature death from all causes by 50%. An effect on mortality risk roughly comparable to smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day and greater than obesity and physical inactivity. What do you think of that? According to Psychology Today in 2013, 2 researchers found that marital conflict led to reports of poorer health. People, though more often than women, had higher risks of disability, reports of pain, and even a higher likelihood of periodontal disease. And this is from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Quote, interactions between infants and caregivers are the basis of children's learning, and from the earliest moments when infants experience the warmth and closeness of being held while being fed, the interplay of relationships and development begins. Over time and with repetition, the relationship evolves through ongoing interactions between the child and the caregiver. The relationships formed with significant primary caregivers become the core context of the child's development, the nurture part of the nature-nurture balance that ultimately defines whom the child is to become. It is known that human connections shape the neural connections from which the mind emerges. So relationships are fundamental to who we are as human beings. They shape us, they form us, and that's true from the beginning of our life to the end of our life. There's an old saying that a fish doesn't know that it swims in water. You've heard that saying? Relationships are the water we swim in. Okay? Every day, relationships are the water we swim in. And we don't realize that we're swimming in that water until that water becomes either toxic or we're taken out of the water. The fish doesn't know it's swimming in water until the water becomes polluted. Or the fish is taken out of the water. Then the fish becomes aware really quickly that it was swimming in water. We take our relationships for granted, especially in relationship to critical times like succession planning in a family business. We take them for granted and we don't realize how important and fundamental they are to the whole process. The whole process is built upon that until they become toxic. How many of us know family business stories where everything fell apart in terms of the business because of the relationships? Mike probably has a few stories about that from a legal point of view. I mean, we've seen it all the time. I've seen it for 30 years. The best laid legal and financial plans collapse because of conflict, because of the breakdown of relationships. And we don't realize that because we take them for granted. Our relationships are so fundamental. It's the water we swim in, and we don't recognize it until something goes wrong with it. Okay. So what I want to talk about then is that bottom part of that triangle, down here, keeping relationships healthy. What does that mean? I think most of us sort of know what it means to keep a business healthy. We have to have an efficient business. We have to have a productive business. We have to have a business that is growing. All of those elements from Business 101, just from a purely business point of view, we know what it means to have a healthy business. But what does it mean? What does it take to have relationships be healthy? And I want to boil this down to be as succinct about it as I can. The basis of every relationship that we have in life is commitment. The basis of every relationship we have in life is commitment. And what do I mean by that? Commitment is what two people rely upon each other or expect of each other over time. Okay? If the commitment isn't there, then the relationship fails. Okay? So commitment is what I expect of you and what you expect of me. Commitment is the foundation upon which relationships are built, just like the foundation upon which a house is built. And that house built upon the foundation requires that foundation to be strong. And that goes to the raw materials that go into making that foundation, the cement, the aggregate, the sand, the water. If those elements are somehow compromised, then the foundation will not be strong and it will fail as the weight of the building sits upon it. Okay? We're talking about succession planning. Succession planning will fail if the foundation of the relationships is compromised and crumbles under the weight of that responsibility. Okay? As some of you know, I spent part of my time in Florida. And down there, they found that some of the buildings along the ocean were failing after about 20 years. The concrete was just crumbling. And they couldn't figure out why this seemed to be happening so prevalently. And they discovered that when the builders built the buildings, they went to the closest source of sand they could find to put into their concrete mixture, which is where? Beach. On the beach. Well, if you take sand off of the beach, what's in the sand? Salt. So they pour the sand into the cement mix, into the concrete mix, and after 20 years, the salt starts working at the steel and everything else, and the buildings were failing. Okay? So it's the raw ingredients that go into building that foundation that are so vital to maintaining that foundation strength. Now, in terms of commitment as the foundation of our relationships, what are the raw ingredients, the raw materials that go into the foundation? Expectations. Okay? Honesty and expectations, that's right. Honest expectations, clear, concise expectations. Now, I was talking with I had to go through a bout of physical therapy, and the guy that did the evaluation on me, they were very friendly. They always talk about, well, what did you do? What did you do? Blah, 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 blah. So he said, well, I've got this I've got this friend of a roommate of mine, and he was telling me about all of the issues that he has, and I said, yeah, well, that happens. He said, so what do I do? I said, it's all about expectations. It has to do with making sure that the expectations among people are clear. Here's what an expectation is. When it comes to interpersonal relationships, and this may sound a little harsh, I don't mean it that way, but it's truth. We all listen to the same radio station. It's called WIIFM. What's in it for me? Okay? When we're forming expectations in a relationship, we look at that relationship and we say, what am I going to need to invest in that relationship in exchange for what I'm going to get out of that relationship? And, when you're dating or you're trying to find a partner for life, you go through a number of them because you've eventually come to the conclusion that I think I'm going to have to put more into this than I'm going to get out of it. Same way with employees, employers, whatever the relationship is. So the what's in it for me question is always at the forefront of the expectations. And so it's vital that expectations be clear. And this is one of the things that Susan is working on. And in a family business and succession planning, the further you get out from the senior generation to the next generations and beyond, the more important and critical this becomes to make sure those expectations are clear. As I often said, the difference between a second generation family business and a third is that in the third generation, they didn't grow up in the same family. So as you get out beyond that second generation into the third generation and beyond as you are, people didn't grow up in the same family. So there's different values, there's different lifestyles, there's different perspectives on things. So what is it that maintains that strong commitment? It's going back to the expectations. We need to be clear with each other what our expectations are. What am I going to need to invest in this relationship in exchange for what I'm going to get out of it? When those expectations become clear, then we can move to a commitment because that's the raw material. Now, something interesting happens though with this commitment that is so strong and the foundation is so strong at the beginning. Things change. Okay? Life changes. We get older. The world changes around us. There are all kinds of changes that take place in our lives. And what happens when changes occur in our relationships is it alters the expectations. The young couple gets married. They have a great life together, and then they have a baby. They need to sit down and talk about how does this alter our expectations of each other? Where do you and I fit into this now 3-person family? Okay? Is our time together going to be compromised because we have a child to care for? An employee is hired by a business. They've just gone through the whole interviewing process. They've talked about expectations. What's in it for me? What am I going to get out of this in exchange for what I have to put into it? They go to work for the business, and all of a sudden they discover things about the company that weren't talked about, that they didn't know about, that are a surprise to them. Or the employer realizes there's some things about this person's work ethic that surprise me. The commitment begins to change. And these are not like earthquake things. These are like the little aftershocks, the little tremors that create little cracks in the foundation. Okay? And as those cracks gather together, they become a big crack. And eventually the foundation fails, commitment fails over time. So what's the antidote for that? Well, I'll go back to my concrete analogy. I was involved in a project in Florida in our building, and we had to replace a whole bunch of concrete in a parking garage. And I found from the engineer that there's an additive you can put into concrete, into the mix, that actually seals the cracks, the little hairline cracks that occur in concrete. So water can't get in there. Okay? Wow, what an idea. Well, what is it that is like that additive in our foundation of our relationships that heals those little cracks that occur? Well, it's called the renewing of our expectations. As things change in our lives, as things change in the business, and your life is not the same today as it was a few years ago. Probably even than it was a few months ago. This business is not the same as it was a few years ago, let alone a few months ago. Okay? Life goes on, life changes, and as it goes on, those little tremors create those cracks. And so what has to happen is it's critical that as this commitment here is affected by change, it creates altered expectations, and this relationship roadmap depicts exactly what has to happen. We have to go back and we have to talk again about expectations on a regular basis. Whether that's with your spouse, or with an employee, or with your employer, or with a family member, or with a friend. It's critical to go back and talk about the expectations and say, I was surprised by what you said the other day, or I didn't know you felt that way, or I didn't know you had those kinds of aspirations. I didn't know that was important to you. Those little changes need to be talked about and renegotiated over time. If relationships are so important, as I think we would all agree they are, and if it's vital that we maintain healthy relationships as the foundation of the succession planning, how do we do that? Well, there's two pillars to maintain health in every relationship. One is called relationship character, and the other is relationship capability. Both of these things have to be worked on simultaneously. Let me explain what we mean by that. Relationship capability are the tools that we need in order to maintain healthy relationships. And let me just say as an aside, everyone needs to be aware that every relationship we have in life has maintenance costs attached to it. Okay? And the goal is to have the lowest possible maintenance costs. We all have relationships with people that we describe as high maintenance. So when I say that, we all know what we mean, right? Okay. So the goal is to maintain maintenance costs at the lowest possible level. It's just like your automobile or your house or anything else. It is going to deteriorate over time, just like your relationship will deteriorate over time if you don't have a preventive maintenance program in place to manage it, okay? So the preventive maintenance program involves these two elements, capability and character. I'm going to start with character. At the core of commitment, and it was mentioned earlier, at the core of commitment in every relationship are three things: trust, respect, and optimism. Trust is basically a measure of what I can count on you for. Okay? A respect is a measure of how much do we regard and value each other. And optimism is a measure of how much we really can get done together. Are we optimistic about what we can do together? Those are the three elements that create the character, the personality, if you will, of every relationship. Some relationships are high in trust, respect, and optimism, and others are low in trust, respect, and optimism. In other words, they rotate more around mistrust, disrespect, and pessimism. And all of us are involved in both of those kinds of relationships. So we need to promote trust, respect, and optimism. And how do we do that? Well, very simply, it's through capability. The capability of the relationship to manage itself and maintain itself. One of those capabilities is communication. If I were to ask you the question, what is the purpose of communication, what would you say?
To get an honest answer.
To get an honest answer?
To listen.
To listen? The real purpose of communication involves both of those. It's to create understanding. Okay? Communication that doesn't achieve the purpose of creating understanding doesn't achieve its ultimate purpose. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because when we communicate with another person for the purpose of creating understanding, and it goes to your comment, Marnie, has to do with listening. There's a reason God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth. Listening is not a passive skill, it's an active skill. In fact, we call it active listening. And so listening is a skill that creates understanding. If I'm talking with Paul and I are having a conversation about something, and particularly if we have a difference of opinion about it. And Paul believes that I'm not listening for the purpose of creating understanding, I'm listening for the purpose of reloading, of arguing with him. If he believes that, then he knows that I'm not fully listening to what he has to say. I'm not truly valuing his opinion about things. But however, if Paul believes that I'm listening for the purpose of understanding, and I can say to Paul, Paul, I don't think I agree with you, but let me make sure I understand what you're saying. And I can let him know to his satisfaction that I do understand, whether I agree or not. Then I have just put a green stamp in the trust bucket with Paul. Because when we listen for the purpose of creating understanding, we build trust. Very, very important point. It's not just because we're being nice, it's because we're building trust in the relationship. If we're secretive or if we listen for the purpose of reloading or having our counter argument ready, what do we do to trust? We break trust down. And if that pattern goes on over time of listening for the purpose of responding rather than listening for the purpose of creating understanding, trust will be eroded incrementally over time. So that's one of the important capabilities. And it has to do with every level of your relationships. When you have board meetings, when you have employer-employee meetings. I mean, if you have a meeting with your employee and the employee is saying something to you that you disagree with, how important is it for that employee to know that you may disagree, but you understand what they're trying to say? Very important to building the trust. The second skill is managing change, and that's the whole process that I laid out there in the relationship roadmap. Managing change involves handling the changes that affect and alter expectations. If you're not doing that, then you're letting the changes and the altered expectations manage you. Okay? Change happens. It's inevitable. But we can manage change rather than letting change manage us and not let it erode our expectations of each other and destroy the foundation of our relationship. And as we do that, guess what? We're building respect between us. If I come back to you and I say, you know, the other day you said something that is bothering me and I'd like to talk to you about it. And the way we're going to talk about it is, I'm not saying this, but in my head, the way I want to talk about it is using my best skill of listening for the purpose of creating understanding. Okay? So that's how it ties together. So we're listening for the purpose of creating understanding to resolve the challenge which came up because of something you said the other day. If I come back to the person and bring that up, am I coming back because I want to have an axe to grind or I want to get even or something? No, I'm coming back because I care about the relationship and I know if I don't do that, that is going to compound on other things and it's going to erode the respect that we have for each other. And the last is having a method for solving problems. And I won't go into that in any depth, but there needs to be a process. I recommend that boards of directors have a process, a problem-solving process, and there are all kinds of them out there. But everybody agrees, when we have an issue we have to deal with, here's the process we're going to go through in order to address that issue. And it involves fact-finding, it involves good communication, it involves bringing that problem to a close. So often what happens when problems persist over time and they never get resolved is they erode the optimism. So if we can face a problem together, we can solve that problem together, we build optimism in our relationship in its ability to handle those things. So those are the two pillars that support relationships: trust, respect, and optimism, and communication for the purpose of creating understanding, managing change that alters expectations and renewing and renegotiating those expectations, and having a method for resolving problems that come up between us, which they inevitably will. Those are the two pillars that go all the way back to the foundation, the lowest level of the triangle. And I can talk about that in 20 minutes, but putting that into practice in your life, in the various aspects of your life, whether it's in business or personal, is vitally important and also not all that easy. But that's why it's down at the bottom, and one of the things that we've been working on, to your question, Marty, over the last couple of years, is how do we begin to build mechanisms into everything that's going on at Babbitt Ranches to help maintain and promote healthy relationships within and between generations. When we do that, then we create a good dialogue between that and the healthy business. One of the things I like to see in every business and this goes to the second tier, are what I call a dashboard. Like the dashboard on your car. It has a speedometer, tells you how fast you're going so you don't get a ticket. It has a heat gauge on there. It tells you whether your car is overheating. It has a thing that tells you whether your alternator is charging. You know, it has these gauges. Every business needs a dashboard like that with certain agreed upon, what I call metrics, so that you could look at it and say, everything's going well. Or you can look at it and say, oh, it's getting a little hot. You know, the engine's getting hot. We better do something about this. Or the ammeter's not charging, and so we're going to run out of juice here before long. So that you have some way of looking at this, not that you're wedded to it on a overly overdone basis, but that you have these things that are in place, everybody agrees on them, and this is what we as directors, this is what we as managers, this is what we as leaders are going to look at, and we're all looking at the same dashboard. Everybody is brought along in that process together, so that all of a sudden someday something is announced that such and such is going to take place, and everybody's saying, where did that come from? That's the relationship piece of it. If the relationships are maintained intact and are healthy, and their expectations are clear and the commitment is strong, then you can weather these storms that go along. But if they're not, whatever the storm is, it's going to magnify the failure that's going on in the relationships. And if the relationships are strong, it's going to make handling that storm so much easier. And you've experienced storms, you're experiencing storms, and you will experience storms. But maintaining that base of healthy relationships among the shareholders and among all of the, talk about stakeholders, among all of the interested parties, the cowboys out on the ranch, as well as Billy in his office, all the way around, that everybody is on the same page, makes weathering those storms so much easier, and that maintains the healthy business.
Wow, what a special presentation. Thank you, Dr. Hoover, for being with us today. If you're interested in more about Dr. Hoover, look him up online. He has 2 very terrific books on family business and on relationship. Sure hope you have a terrific day today, and look forward to more about relationship intelligence in the future. Take care.